Today we return to life and times of Jacob, and in particular what we have to learn from Jacob as a role model for us. And as undoubtedly you have seen in my description of the title, the specific aspects of Jacob's biography upon which I'd like to focus as the basis for our being able to harness Jacob as a role model for us are the unlikely roles of strong man, family man, and businessman. So I thought the first thing we should do before anything else is see just how Jacob is manifest in these three ways to us. So we begin by considering them sequentially in Jacob's biography as they emerge, in particular in Genesis chapters 29 and 30. At the beginning of Genesis chapter 29, Jacob's role as strongman is fairly self-evident. Then Jacob went on his journey and came to the land of the children of the east. And you undoubtedly recall the details of the story, so I'll consider them only in brief, since our time, after all, is limited. He gets to Haran and sees a well in the field with 3 flocks of sheep lying by it. And the Bible points out to us, as will become very relevant in the story that follows, that the stone upon the well's mouth was great. And indeed, then, in verse 3, thither were all the flocks gathered, and they rolled the stone from the well's mouth and watered the sheep, and put the stone back upon the well's mouth in its place. This was standard procedure. And indeed, as emerges in the continuation of the narrative, Jacob inquires of the shepherds why they are waiting around the well as they are, and they report to him they have a problem with the stone that is on the mouth of the well, and that only once all the flocks are gathered together, then they roll the stone from the well's mouth, and then we water the sheep. And 2 verses afterward, we read rather impressively that when Jacob saw Rachel, the daughter of Laban, his mother's brother, and the sheep of Laban, his mother's brother, that Jacob went near and rolled the stone from the well's mouth and watered the flock of Laban, his mother's brother. So this stone that 3 strapping shepherds couldn't possibly budge, such that they needed to wait for all the shepherds to come together, Jacob single-handedly is able to roll off the mouth of the well, which of course is a very impressive story of Jacob as strong man. And I suppose for most of us, in our mind's eye, in our envisioning this story, we picture Jacob as a very impressive, strapping young man who has the wherewithal to best all these other shepherds. I don't know how old we would imagine him to be. I guess someplace at the physical prime of life. And it is instructive then for us to consider how old Jacob really was at this point. Now, fortunately, we have verses that can provide us with the necessary insight in order to be able to resolve this question. So, with respect to establishing an appropriate chronology for Jacob's career. We note first that the period of time that Jacob was in Haran starts, of course, with, as we read in the continuation of chapter 29, Jacob offering Lavan that he would serve Lavan for 7 years in order to marry Rachel, Lavan's younger daughter. And indeed, the Bible reports that he did so. Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed to him but a few days for the love he had of her. And what follows, of course, after the 7 years is the wedding, much to Jacob's surprise and consternation, the wedding with Leah, which is, of course, followed a week later by his wedding to Rachel, and followed in turn by another 7 years of service for Lavan. Now that amounts to a total of 14 years, and we should note in evaluating the time frame of Jacob's sojourn in Haran that all of the children that he fathered in Haran were fathered during those second 7 years. How do I know that? Well, I know that because in chapter 30, we read in verse 25, and it came to pass when Rachel had borne Joseph that Jacob said to Lavan, send me away that I may go unto my own place and to my country. Give me my wives and my children for whom I have served you, and let me go, for you know my service wherewith I served you. Whereupon Lavan says, if now I have found favor in your eyes, I have observed the signs, and God has blessed me for your sake, so let's make a deal. And of course, the form that that deal takes is Jacob begins to serve Lavan not for his daughters, because he's already served his time with respect to the daughters, but rather in order to be able to secure a salary, the flocks. And this indeed is then what ensues. In chapter 31, when Jacob is making his final statement to Lavan and recalling the period of his service, he states in verse 38, these 20 years have I been with you. Your ewes and your she-goats have not cast their young, and the rams of your flock I have not eaten. And in verse 41, these 20 years have I been in your house. I served you 14 years for your 2 daughters, and 6 years for your flock, and you changed my wages 10 times. Now, what's of course important for us to derive from this, very simply, is that if earlier on in chapter 30, when Jacob said to Lavan, I'm finished and I'm ready to leave, that was at the end of the 14 years and the beginning of the 6 years of working for the sheep. And it was at that time, remember what Scripture stated, it was at that time that Joseph had been born. Because after all, when Scripture tells us that Jacob is stating this to Lavan in chapter 30, the emphasis explicitly is that when Rachel had borne Joseph. So, brace yourselves, folks. We have a little bit more arithmetic to do here. But at this point, what we have clearly established is that Joseph was born 14 years after Jacob's arrival in Haran. Now, if only we could find some point in their lives that establishes unambiguously how much older Jacob was than Joseph, then we can figure out how old Jacob was, of course, when Joseph was born. Well, it turns out we can do so, because Scripture, in fact, tells us in the biography of Joseph pardon me for a moment with the scrolling here. That in Genesis chapter 41, when Joseph comes before Pharaoh and gives him the interpretation of Pharaoh's dream, a couple of points of interest. First, in verse 29, behold, there come 7 years of great plenty throughout all the land of Egypt. Then, in verse 30, there shall arise after them 7 years of famine. So we're given the chronology of the years of plenty and the years of famine. We are further told by Joseph in verse 32, and for that the dream was doubled unto Pharaoh twice, that is, seeing both the 7 lean and 7 fat cows, and the 7 lean and 7 fat ears of grain. It is because the thing is established by God, and God will shortly bring it to pass. So, we can inevitably then conclude from what Joseph is saying here that the 7 years of plenty began very shortly after this event, and here it is in verse 46, we are told that at this time Joseph was 30 years old. Well, how can we calibrate that with Jacob's age? Answer, very simply. We just have to continue this progression a bit further and recognize that when Joseph reveals himself to his brothers in chapter 45, here we have it, in chapter 45, when Joseph says to his brothers that I am Joseph, and he tells them in verse 4, come near to me, I pray you, and he then stresses to them, don't be aggrieved over your having sold me here, because God sent me before you to preserve life. And here is where we get to the chronology. For these 2 years has a famine been in the land, and there are yet 5 years in which there shall be neither plowing nor harvest. Okay, so by simple arithmetic then, this is taking place 9 years after Joseph first stood before Pharaoh, right? 30 plus 7 years of plenty plus 2 years of famine. So at this juncture, Joseph is, of course, 39 years old. And at this juncture, how old is Jacob? Well, in chapter 47, we read, Joseph brought in Jacob his father and set him before Pharaoh, and Jacob blessed Pharaoh. And in chapter 47, verse 8, Pharaoh said to Jacob, how many are the days of the years of your life? Now, in verse 9, admittedly, Jacob gives a somewhat circuitous answer to the question. That is something we may have occasion to discuss at greater length at some other juncture. But what's relevant right now for us is that Jacob says to Pharaoh, the days of the years of my sojourning are 130 years. He's 130 years old. This conclusion is further corroborated when we consider that later on, in verse 28, before Jacob's death, the Bible tells us, and Jacob lived in the land of Egypt 17 years, so the days of Jacob, the years of his life, were 147 years. Well, after 17 years, a 130-year-old would indeed be 147. But let's do the arithmetic now. At this point, when Jacob comes to Egypt, he is 130. Joseph is 39. By simple arithmetic, Jacob is 91 years older than Joseph. 130 minus 39. Well, that means that when Joseph was born, Jacob was 91 years old. Remember, we already concluded that Joseph was born 14 years after Jacob's arrival in Haran. 14 years after the incident with the well and the stone covering it. In other words, the episode in which Jacob is revealed to us as strong man took place when Jacob was 91 minus 14 equals 77 years old. He was an advanced septuagenarian. And here he is, the strapping strong man who rolls the stone over the well. We can only imagine what he must have been like in his prime. But maybe he was still in his prime at age 77. Certainly gives us a different spin on the story. And I should emphasize that different spin on the story because I think it also helps us to understand an additional dimension, that is, recall the manner in which Jacob addresses Lavan upon completing his 7 years of service that were, of course, intended to be in order to secure Rachel's hand in marriage. Back in Genesis chapter 29, after we read in verse 20 that Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, in verse 21, Jacob said to Lavan, "Give me my wife, for my days are filled, that I may go in unto her." Now this is biblical idiom, fairly thinly veiled euphemism for the relations between a husband and wife. It seems almost crassly unseemly that Jacob would express himself in such a vulgar manner in describing what to him was the urgency of marrying here, until you consider he's already a man at this point. Remember, this isn't even 77. This is when he's already 84. 7 years later. He's well into his 80s, and he still doesn't have a family. He hasn't married, has no children, and he has a mission to continue the legacy of Abraham and Isaac to the next generation. So Jacob sounds like he's urgently pressed for time when he says to Lavan, "Give me my wife, for my days are filled, that I may go in unto her." Well, maybe the simplest explanation is he is pressed for time, but not because he is an impatient 20-year-old, rather because he is an exceedingly patient 84-year-old who doesn't know how much more time he has left. In any case, this completes stage 1 in our excerpted biography for today, Jacob as strongman. And of course, very much in the immediate aftermath of what Jacob requests of Lavan in having an opportunity to consummate his marriage, we read in the continuation of chapters 29 and 30 a very vivid description in very rapid-fire succession of Jacob starting his family. Beginning in chapter 29, verse 32, Leah conceived and bore a son, and she called his name Reuben. And the following verse, verse 33, the birth of Simeon. And in verse 34, birth of son number 3, Levi. Birth of the fourth son in the following verse, in verse 35, Yehuda, Judah. If it seems like the Bible is giving us a rather hasty list of progeny, well, I guess the answer is, it is, because you have in rapid-fire succession these 4 sons being born, and of course, as you undoubtedly recall, it doesn't end here. That is rather on the contrary. You definitely encounter in further rapid-fire succession what happens next at the beginning of chapter 30, that in chapter 30, verse 5, the second wife who begins to bear Jacob's children, Bilhah, Rachel's handmaid, gives birth to Dan in verse 6 and to Naphtali in verse 8. And of course, we recognize very well, but we aren't finished yet, that is, in the continuation of chapter 30, after what evidently amounted to a rather brief interval, a respite from her childbearing, Leah is concerned that she hasn't been giving birth for, I don't know, maybe the last 2 months. So in chapter 30, she has her handmaid, Zilpah, become the third wife of Jacob to begin bearing his children. And so in verse 10 in chapter 30, we read, Zilpah bore Jacob a son, and this is, as we read in verse 11, the birth of God. Following is verse 12, the birth of the next son, who in verse 13 is named Asher. And then Leah returns to her childbearing, and in verse 17 bears a 5th son, that is her 5th son. Bear in mind, of course, this is son number 9 in the succession that we've just read, and this, of course, is, as we read in verse 18, the birth of Issachar. The following verse informs us of the birth of the 6th son of Leah, son number 10 of Jacob, the birth of Zebulun. As we see in verse 20. And then in verse 21, Leah has her 7th child, Jacob's 11th, her daughter Dinah, and finally, in the continuation of the chapter, we read in verse 22 that God remembered Rachel, and now Rachel too has a son. In verse 24, then we read of the birth of Jacob's 12th child, Joseph. Jacob, as family man, he has 12 children, 11 sons and 1 daughter, in the space of, I guess we could say, a little bit over 6 years. That is, it's 7 years from when he marries Leah and then Rachel until the 12th of these children is born. Certainly, a very concentrated emphasis upon beginning a family, to put it mildly. So this, of course, is in very rapid-fire succession our second installment in this excerpted biography of Jacob, Jacob as family man. And just as it followed on the heels of Jacob as strong man, immediately following on the heels of Jacob as family man, we read about Jacob as businessman. That is, in the verses that follow, as we already noted in chapter 30, verse 25, and it came to pass when Rachel had borne Joseph that Jacob said to Lavan, "Send me away that I may go unto my own place and to my country, as I want to go home. My 14 years of service are over. Give me my wives and my children, for whom I have served you, and let me go." And Jacob said, Laban says in response to Jacob's statement, "If now I have found favor in your eyes, I have observed the signs, and God has blessed me for your sake. So," in verse 28, "appoint me your wages, and I will give it." And what follows then, of course, is the extended narrative. I didn't excerpt it on the pages here because our time is limited, but the ins and outs of Lavan doing his utmost to evade any payment to Jacob, and ultimately the story of how Jacob prevails, and the synopsis at the end of it all in verse 43, "And the man increased exceedingly, and had large flocks, and maidservants, and menservants, and camels, and donkeys." So, Jacob as businessman. And once again, we encounter the extraordinary dedication and extraordinary success that we've already seen in Jacob as both strong man and family man. And of course, inevitably, when we consider in retrospect what the Bible is telling us about Jacob, this really seems strange. Perhaps we could even say grating. This is what we need to hear about Jacob, about his foci upon such material pursuits, the strong man, having the big family, having the large flocks, his success in business. Shouldn't the Bible be emphasizing exclusively Jacob as man of the Spirit? And of course, inevitably, we recognize that in the Bible's emphasis, that dichotomy that we might have been liable to draw between the spirit and the material pursuits just doesn't exist. And there are a number of lessons that I think it is crucially important for us to derive precisely from the fact that that dichotomy does not exist. I'd like to focus in particular on 3 such lessons, 3 aspects that I think underlie the Bible's emphasis upon Jacob in this manner. The first, admittedly, applies it's not uniquely to Jacob alone, to the patriarchs, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I think it also has implications to us. The second and third aspects that I'd like to discuss undoubtedly pertain very much directly to each and every one of us. So without any further ado, we continue. Recall what God said, not so much to Abraham, but regarding Abraham. In chapter 18, verse 19. We discussed these words some weeks ago. God says, I have known him to the end that he may command his children and his household after him, that they may keep the way of God to do righteousness and justice. In other words, God's charge to Abraham, and of course inevitably, by extension, to Isaac and to Jacob, is the establishment of a covenantal community. That he and they will command their children and household to keep the way of God to do righteousness and justice. Whatever the patriarchs are doing as a means to the fulfillment of that divine charge is in itself an act of divine service, an act of serving the Almighty. In particular, of course, with respect to Jacob himself, this is a point of emphasis that we note necessarily in Genesis chapter 28, that when God speaks to Jacob in that inaugural prophecy, the ladder that is standing on earth and whose head reaches the heavens, God says, I am the Lord, God of Abraham, your father, and God of Isaac. The land whereon you lie, to you I will give it, and to your seed. And in verse 14, your seed will be as the dust of the earth. Of course, we can read dust of the earth as stressing how numerous your seed will ultimately be. And while I'm not in any way denying that aspect of the blessing, I think given the continuation of the verse, there's an additional dimension that we could also emphasize. In the continuation of the verse, after speaking about your spreading west, east, north, and south, in you and in your seed shall all the families of the earth be blessed. And you know, the dust of the earth, that seems so lowly to us, that everything that grows is planted in the dust of the earth. The dust of the earth is a means for cultivating the world. In you and in your seed, all the families of the earth will be blessed. So this blessing, as God's statement about Abraham and his progeny, is of course a great gift. But gifts from God always have attendant responsibilities. And of course, to that extent then, the patriarchs, Abraham and Isaac as well, but we're focusing upon Jacob, keenly appreciate that it is their responsibility to do everything in their power to live up to this divine mission, and of course within the bounds of what is appropriate conduct, to ensure that that emergent covenantal community, that emergent nation will indeed be the final result. And therefore, of course, they apparently material pursuits of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob aren't just material. They are also acts of divine service. Again, I emphasize, we might tend on our own to draw some artificial line of demarcation between matters of the spirit and matters of, well, matter. The spiritual versus the physical. Yeah, but the patriarchs serve in the archetypal role of emphasizing to us that everything that seems to us to be a material pursuit can indeed be seen as subordinate to the spiritual. The spirit, of course, is the overarching goal. It is the point of emphasis. But in advancing that spiritual end, inevitably, material means are required too. Of course, it's not by any means any sort of everything goes, the means justify the ends. Rather, on the contrary, it is appreciating that what might otherwise be viewed as simply mundane activities, bereft of any abiding spiritual content, have indeed spiritual content because of the intention, the dedication on the part of the person who's engaging in them. So yes, Jacob engages in material pursuits, and as such, he is strong man, family man, and businessman. And every one of those roles for Jacob is subordinate to being spiritual man. That, of course, is our first point of emphasis, and indeed, as such, we continue further in appreciating the extent to which this is very much the focus of how we see Jacob in these passages manifest to us as an extension of the above, continuing with the second aspect in our discussion of why these emphases with respect to Jacob. I'd like to focus in particular on what Jacob says to Lavan in that final encounter between them in chapter 31, because I think it is very much informed precisely by this coherence of material and spiritual. Jacob emphasizes to Lavan, and we noted this briefly at the beginning of the session, these 20 years have I been with you, your ewes and she-goats have not cast their young, the rams of your flocks, I have not eaten that which was torn of beasts, I brought not unto you, that is, if wild animals attacked the flocks, I bore the loss of it, I made up for it, of my hand you required it, whether stolen by day or by night, thus I was in the day, the drought consumed me, and the frost by night, and my sleep fled from my eyes. He didn't have an easy time of it at all. On the contrary, he really emphasized the faithfulness of his service and the extent to which he dedicated himself to his work, literally, day and night. But now look at what he says by way of conclusion in verse 42. Except the God of my father, the God of Abraham, and the fear of Isaac had been on my side, surely now you would send me away empty-handed. But God has seen my affliction and the labor of my hands and gave judgment yesternight. What's Jacob saying here? The emphasis. That if it were up to you, all of the efforts that I expended would have amounted to nothing, because you did your utmost to cheat me out of any legitimate, hard-earned gain from my efforts. But the God of my father, the God of Abraham and the fear of Isaac, was on my side. Was on my side and ensured that I would indeed prevail. Based upon what? Why indeed was God on my side? In our tradition, this is a very keen point of emphasis, that God has seen my affliction and the labor of my hands. He saw that I was striving to earn an honest living. He saw the hard work that I was investing and gave judgment yesternight. You might have thought, God already promised Jacob his blessings. Back in Genesis chapter 28, I will watch over you wherever you go. So, wouldn't it have been enough for Jacob to just sit back and wait for those blessings to just come rolling over him? Like maybe he should have just reclined with his mouth open, waiting for the blessings to just pour in. Of course, I'm saying this is a caricature. The reality is precisely the opposite. When God promises his blessings, that's all the more a summons, a charge for you to be worthy of those blessings. And again, that worthiness does not come about by drawing some artificial line of distinction between the material and the spiritual. On the contrary, it's precisely because you integrate the two. And that's what Jacob is doing. There's the promise of God's blessing. And there is the manner in which Jacob earned the blessing. Through the labor of my hands, through hard work. So it is precisely through the emphasis on the material that you get the spiritual, the blessings of God. Now, of course, inevitably, we appreciate, in talking about that first aspect, as we noted, that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob know that they have a divine mission to establish a covenantal community, to establish a nation that will serve as the means through which the entire world will be blessed. That aspect, of course, as we noted, is one that, at least formally, applies, of course, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and really, apart from them, and our holy mothers, no one else. After all, we're not engaged in producing a nation through our progeny. Yeah, but the principle certainly does. And the principle, as it is expressed here, most definitely does. You have the wherewithal to appeal to God for his blessings. You do it through the hard material work, the efforts you expend in this world. Again, there might have been that allure to draw some artificial boundary line, a border between the material and the spiritual. We don't believe in any such boundary line. Rather, on the contrary, Jacob works in this world. And it is precisely because of Jacob, and of course, Abraham and Isaac as well, working in this world, seeing their responsibilities in this worldly arena, that, as our commentators note, in Exodus chapter 3, at the burning bush, when Moses asks God, how am I to introduce you to the people of Israel, to the Hebrews in bondage in Egypt? God says to Moses, you shall say to the people of Israel, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me unto you. This is my name forever, and this is my memorial unto all generations. Because, more than anything else, this is the emphasis. This is the way we encounter that divine message, by considering the implications in the role models of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Again, this is my name forever, and this is my memorial unto all generations. And it's on that note, broadening the message still further, that I'd like us to consider what this tells us about the message of Jacob as role model on these ostensibly material planes. And returning to our starting point, Jacob as strong man, except that we realize at this point that he was a strong man at age 77. Inevitably, I think, we hear the resonance of the message in Psalm 92. The righteous shall flourish like a palm tree. He shall grow like a cedar in Lebanon. Planted in the house of God, they shall flourish in the courts of our God. They shall still bring forth fruit in old age. They shall be full of sap and richness, to declare that God is upright, my rock in whom there is no unrighteousness. Consider what these words are telling us. Yeah, a natural expectation is when you get to old age, and at 77, Jacob is certainly not a youngster. The physical begins to decay. All that is based upon matter ultimately submits to the inevitable process of material decline. Things fall apart, including our bodies. But what the psalmist tells us here in Psalm 92 is, for the righteous, on the contrary, they flourish like a palm tree, they grow like a cedar in Lebanon, even in old age. They still bring forth fruit in old age. That process of decline somehow seems to us arrested. You know why? Because when you're planted in the house of God, then you continue to flourish. That is, to appreciate that, the ideal, the goal, is not to become the man of spirit to the detriment of anything material, but rather on the contrary, to be so thoroughly, through and through, a man of spirit, that even the material becomes uplifted and exalted through the spiritual. Because, of course, the material has no life of its own. Physical things are never self-justifying. But when you make yourself into a man of the spirit, and someplace even the physical becomes redeemed. So indeed, they still bring forth fruit in old age. And Jacob continues to be Mr. Strongman, even at age 77. And he builds his family. All of his children are born when he is in his 80s and 90s. He doesn't stop. Still bringing forth fruit. The material redeemed through the spiritual. This message of the material being redeemed through the spiritual, upon further reflection, is one with which we are exquisitely familiar, because it is a recurrent theme in Scripture. Of course, this isn't the point that we can afford to discuss exhaustively, because it would take us much, much more time. But just to consider in great brevity, in Leviticus chapter 26, if you walk in my statutes and keep my commandments and do them, then what? Then the consequence of that is the material bounty. I will give you your rains in their season, the produce, the peace in the land, and you will eat old store long kept, because there will be such prosperity. And it's not that this blessing is exclusively material. In the continuation, I will set my tabernacle among you, my soul shall not abhor you, I will walk among you and will be your God, and you will be my people. Yeah, but that is seamlessly connected with the message of material bounty. Because again, when you are spiritually redeemed, that redeems the physical as well. Drawing a line of demarcation between them is just artificial. Ultimately, the spirit should prevail, and prevail entirely. So that, for example, it's not might that makes right, it's actually right that makes might. In our world, all too often, we don't discern that. Because, of course, as you well know, we live today in an unredeemed state. But the Bible is pointing us to an appreciation of another kind of world. The real world in which that dichotomy really, truly doesn't exist. And indeed, in a similar vein, we'll just note briefly, in Deuteronomy chapter 11, it shall come to pass if you hearken diligently unto my commandments, which I command you this day, to love God, and so on. Then, what happens? The rain in its proper season. You gather your corn, your wine, your oil. I will give grass in your fields for your cattle. You will eat and be satisfied. And in far greater elaboration, in Deuteronomy chapter 28, it shall come to pass, if you hearken diligently unto the voice of God your Lord, to observe all of his commandments, which I command you this day, that God will set you on high above all the nations of the earth. And again, it's important for us to appreciate. This, on the one hand, includes the material blessings. All these blessings shall come upon you and overtake you. And of course, it goes together with the spiritual. If you hearken unto the voice of the Lord your God. And of course, by doing so, you are blessed in the city, blessed in the field, blessed in fruit of the body, fruit of the land, fruit of the cattle. You're blessed throughout. Blessed when you come in, blessed when you go out. It's material blessing and spiritual blessing, because the two, of course, ultimately are inseparable. That, more than anything else, is, to my mind, the lesson of Jacob as role model. When we see that the spirit is indeed so fully integrated with the material that the division between the two is simply an artifice, then we recognize that it is precisely by the integration of spirit and matter that we really understand what God's expectation of us is and how we earn his blessing. And it is on that note that I'd just like to conclude with considering an interesting contrast that we encounter in these chapters concerning the life and times of Jacob, in particular, between the first explicit revelation of God to Jacob. Of course, we know the vision of the ladder standing on earth and its head is in the heavens, and the vision that's described by Jacob to his wives in Genesis chapter 31. There are some obvious parallels. There's a kind of symmetry between these two visions. The one at the beginning of Jacob's sojourn in Haran, outside of the Holy Land, and the other precisely at the end. In chapter 28, verse 10, Jacob went out of Beersheba and went toward Haran. And in his dream, he dreamed, behold, the ladder was set up on the earth, and the top of it reached to heaven, and behold, the angels, messengers of God, were ascending and descending upon it. This, the vision that Jacob sees at the beginning of his career, and then, again, at the very end, Jacob describes to his wives what he just saw at the end, just before the decision to go back home. He says to his wives, verse 10, came to pass that when the flock conceived, I lifted up my eyes and saw in a dream, and behold, the he-goats which leaped upon the flock were streaked, speckled, and grizzled, which was the term of employment with Lavan to get the goats that were streaked, speckled, and grizzled. And again he sees an angel, a messenger of God, that this angel said to me in a dream, Jacob, I said, here I am. And he said, lift up now your eyes and see all the he-goats which leap upon the flock are streaked, speckled, and grizzled, for I have seen all that Lavan does to you. And the following verse really completes the symmetry. In the first vision, it was seeing angels of God going up and down that holy ladder that leads to heaven. And here there's also an angel of God. And here too, just as in that first vision, it was when Jacob was leaving Beersheba, leaving the Holy Land, and going to Haran. This vision ends with a charge. I am the God of Bethel, where you anointed a pillar, where you vowed unto me, of course explicitly referring to that first revelation. Now arise and get you out from this land and return to the land of your nativity. Coming full circle, except the symmetry dramatically, radically breaks down. In the first vision, Jacob is seeing angels ascending and descending a ladder to heaven. And in the second vision, the context in which he sees the angel is with the sheep and the goats. So I have to tell you that I think the conventional comparison between these two visions is to kind of groan and say, look what happened to our father Jacob over the course of 20 years in the household of Lavan. He started out his career with this grand vision of a ladder ascending to heaven and angels ascending and descending upon it to God. And at the end of 20 years, he has a vision of angels, and it's a vision of sheep. Well, after what we've said, I hope you can appreciate that I'm going to turn that comparison on its head and say, look what happened to our father Jacob. At the beginning of his career, he's able to apprehend the vision of angels, but only when the angels are ascending and descending upon a holy ladder that leads them to heaven. At the end of 20 years, he's even able to see angels together with the sheep. Because he's truly integrated this lesson, the coherence between the material and the spiritual. So now, even when he works with sheep, he hears the message of the angels. That's a greater achievement. Once he has indeed reached that level, the angel says, okay, you're finished. Now it's time to go home. You were here for 20 years to be so utterly immersed in the material, in the physicality of Haran and Lavan's household. You've learned the message of taking the material and elevating it by subordinating it to the spiritual. Now you're ready to go home. And now we're ready, all of us, to learn this message. May we indeed learn from the role model of Jacob. Strong man, family man, businessman, all sorts of people, all sorts of roles. Ultimately, all of them subordinated to the Spirit. All of them rolled into Jacob as spiritual men, as men of God. God bless you.